أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين خاتم النبيين سيدنا الممجد بشير المصدق المصطفى الأمجد محمود الأحمد أبي القاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين ولعنة الله على الظالمين من الأولين والآخرين أما بعد فقد قال الله سبحانه وتعالى في كتابه المجيد وفرقانه الحميد وقوله الحق بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ولينصرن الله من ينصره إن الله لقوي عزيز الذين إن مكناهم في الأرض أقاموا الصلاة وآتوا الزكاة وأمروا بالمعروف ونهوا عن المنكر ولله عاقبة الأمور آمنا بالله صدق الله العلي العظيم صلوات على محمد وآل محمد. Awaited Savior of humanity, Imam al-Mahdi alayhi salam, my respected brothers, sisters, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Our series discussing the globalized challenges in this world and looking at the solutions that come forward from the Holy Thaqalain, the Holy Quran, and the Sunnah of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, and particularly that of Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam. In the previous discussion, we looked at the concept of a globalized governance, and that one of the primary challenges or the underlying reason for the way in which the world is today is the structure in which the world is. In that, when you and I have nation states, when we have different countries that seek to territorialize their land, the outcome of this is that human beings do not see each other as one global community, but rather look within the paradigm of their own very narrow-minded concept, and that is of nation states, and to see each other as just for themselves as opposed to looking at the entirety of the world. When you have a border, this separates people from other people. This makes people look at other people as aliens and foreigners, as opposed to being with them in the challenges of their life. When you have governments that have rivalry with others, the outcome of this will be that governments seek to be able to confront others, be stronger than others, manipulate others, corrupt others, all for the purpose of their own one nation being the strongest over all other nations. And so, by nature, this concept has to be in opposition with the way in which Islam seeks for humankind to be. And so we spoke about the need to migrate from the concept of nation states to a more globalized governance, whereby we are able to see the human being as equal, and where human governance comes centrally, and we're able to deal with the challenges at hand centrally, as opposed for the selfishness of one nation looking after its own well-being at the expense of the rest of the world. Now, our discussion this evening, inshallah, is to move the series forward. And one of the natural outcomes of when you have divisions and borders between human beings will be to consider the other human being as not necessarily welcome within your land, or alien, or as a foreigner to your land. The discussion this evening will be about the global refugee and migration crisis that is taking place around the world today. And as we know, when we turn on the TV, when we look in the newspapers, when we turn on social media, right now, one of the main topics regarding the challenges that is present within the world is that of the global refugee and migration crisis. We need to understand, why has this crisis occurred? We need to understand the scale of this crisis. We want to understand what are various countries and governments, what are the various aid agencies doing in order to stem the crisis, and ultimately go back into our texts to revisit the way in which Islam understands the need to take care of refugees and migrants throughout the world. The refugee crisis at the moment is the greatest migration and refugee crisis since the Second World War. And so what we commonly hear is that in the last 60-odd years, this is the greatest migration crisis to hit the world. During the Second World War, when so many countries were at war with each other, this caused, of course, people to flee their homes in order to find refuge elsewhere within the world. And so when you see today, there are certain underlying reasons for so many people seeking to leave one land, one country, in order to migrate to another, in order to seek refuge or asylum in another country. The reasons might be as following. You have war and civil war. You have invasion, occupation, and oppression. You have natural disaster and disease. And all of these different reasons come together as to why people feel that they need to be on the move from their own homelands, the places where they have normally felt secure, in order to find themselves a better life elsewhere. One of the great reasons is underlying many of those reasons, and that is the financial collapse. And when countries and when people who have previously had stable economies have no longer work for themselves, they will be forced to migrate to be able to find work elsewhere throughout the world. And so all of these reasons come together. When you see the world today, the main refugee and migration crisis is taking place from certain countries within the world. Primarily, there is Syria, Iraq, Kuwait. You will also see people migrating from Sudan, people migrating from Somalia and Eritrea, people migrating from Burma across the world into different parts. In particular today, the migration crisis comes from the invasion and occupation of Syria and how Syrians en masse are migrating into different parts of the world. The migration crisis as a whole is affecting 60 million people. There are 60 million people around the world today who are considered to be those who are displaced from their own homes. What does that mean? That means that we have 60 million people around the world today who are unable to live in their own home, and they are now living in tents. United Nations provided tents and refugee camps, tents that go as far as the eye can see. They are living in shelters. They are living in basements of schools, mosques, and churches. They are living in other people's houses, where now people have had to flock together into one particular family, into one particular hotel, one particular room in order to survive. These individuals are fleeing various different areas. And you will see that normally there are 3 different routes that the migrants are taking in order to flee the persecution or the poverty or the war that is taking place. The first is from the northern coast of Africa, and in particular Libya. And they get boats and cross over from the Mediterranean Sea, and they go from Libya to an island off the coast of Italy by the name of Lampedusa. And they try to get into Europe in this way. Another way is for Syrians who are fleeing, trying to get across to Europe. Either they go through Turkey, and Turkey into the southeastern countries within Europe. They will go, for example, to Hungary and to Croatia and to Macedonia, and through these countries eventually move further west into France and Germany, and eventually into the United Kingdom. Another way is to go for boat and to try to cross into the Greek islands. And one particular island, the island of Lesbos, is the destination for many of those who are taking the journey across the seas into Greek islands and in order to get into Europe itself. So these are the three routes that are being taken. 60 million people have been forced out of their homes and are fleeing across the world. In Syria in particular and in Iraq in particular, you see the numbers are particularly devastating. You will see, for example, that 1/2 of Syria has been captured and has been taken over by ISIS. 1/3 of Iraq has been captured and taken over by ISIS. And so you can imagine, with the brutality of ISIS and their governments trying to reclaim and capture those lands, here how war is being sprung up. And then you add the so-called moderate rebels that are also fighting for pieces of the land. With these three, you can imagine how devastating that land is and how people are fleeing and needing to escape because their entire lives have been turned upside down. Instead of having a secure place to live, instead of having a house, instead of having schools, places of business, places to go and purchase your food and your grocery from, all this has been destroyed now. The entire infrastructure has been destroyed, and so there's nothing left for them. And so they must flee in order to gain some sort of security and comfort in their lives. It is important that we explain what is happening in these places where refugees are arriving to, and to understand the level of desperation that is taking place around the world at the moment, to hear from them and their stories, and then to understand how governments and agencies have been responding to the crisis itself. There are certain destinations, as we mentioned, that refugees try to get to, and two of the most famous are the island of Lesbos, which is off the coast of Greece, and then is Calais, which is on the northern tip of France, which is the port area to cross the channel in order to get into the southern coast of Britain, the United Kingdom. And I want to tell you experiences from these two particular destinations and where the refugees are arriving and what their circumstances are at the moment. In Calais, as an example, there are approximately 5,000 refugees. And the camps are divided into two. There is a camp for women's and children's, and there is a camp for the men. And the way these camps are set up is that they are divided into nations. And so countries and people from certain nations cluster together because they speak the same language and they have the same culture and experiences. So for example, there is the Eritrean tent, there is the Iraqi tent, there is the Afghani tent, there are Iranis, and so on and so forth. There are approximately 5,000 refugees living in Calais. Their circumstance is absolutely dire. The first thing is, if they have come from Eritrea, if they have come from Somalia, if they have come from Sudan, if they have come from Iraq, you can see the distance they have had to travel in order to get there. When you ask them, what is your circumstance? How did you get here? What are your needs? They will begin to tell you their stories. And for example, the way in which they live is in a very desperate plight. They live in tents that either they have bought or have been donated to them by the aid agencies. I myself have been to these refugee camps and I've spoken with them directly and I've asked them of their circumstances. When you go into their camps and you go into their tents, these tents are old and battered tents. They have holes in them, and so when it rains, the water falls in. They do not have insulation in their tents, and so as you can imagine, when the French coastal winter comes, when the winds come, when it begins to snow, what their circumstance will be like. They are living on a floodplain which does not drain water away. And so when it rains, water collects and seeps into their tents. And so they often have to take their belongings outside in order for it not to become soaked. When you ask them about their needs, they will say, for example, we are being provided with clothes and food by the aid agencies. And so our basic amenities have been taken care of. But we do not have, for example, pots and pans. The agencies have given to us food, but we have no way to heat the food up. They will say the aid agencies have given to us tea bags, but we do not have a pot to be able to heat the water up. We ask, what do you need? They will say, we are wearing slippers, or we are wearing torn shoes. We desire to be able to run and jump onto trains to be able to make it into England. We want to be able to run and jump onto the top of lorries, or sneak into lorries, or hide ourselves under the bottom of lorries in order to get into the United Kingdom. How can we do so with torn shoes or slippers if we're able to do this? 50 to 100 refugees a day arrive into Calais, and so the need is ever growing and ever expanding. Their circumstance is very desperate. And they're not just any individuals. From our perspective, they are also Shia. And there are maybe 400 Shia of Ahl al-Bayt alayhimus salam living within Calais. And you ask them, how long have you been here for? And many of them will say that we've been here for 4 or for 6 months. Because no one will provide them with a passport. No one will provide them with a solution. No one will provide them with asylum. Then they are living in perpetuity. They spend their days trying to cross over to Britain in order to seek asylum. The border between France and Germany has been closed off, so there is no way for them to go into Germany. The French will not take them as asylum seekers, and so they live for months and months on end off the welfare and the aid of charitable organizations that are willing to give to them. They do not have schools. They do not have education. But these are very talented and educated individuals. They have backgrounds. They have work that they have experience in. But because they have come and sought asylum, there is nothing for them in Europe, and no one will look after them. I asked them, and I asked some of the Shia to tell us their stories and what they underwent. And one of them began to tell his story, and he was sitting with his friends, and they all swear by this very same story. They said that when we were crossing over, we took a boat to get into Europe. And one of the nights when we were on the boat, it was very, very windy. It was a very stormy night, and the waves were crashing over into the boat. And the waves were crashing so hard that we believed that we would be overthrown, we would drown in that sea. In order to find some sort of shifa'ah, we took out our turba, the turba that we pray upon, the turba of Imam al-Hussein salawatullah wa salamuhu alayh, and we crushed it and we dropped it into the sea to ask for the shifa'ah and the wasila of Aba Abdullah al-Hussein salawatullah wa salamuhu alayh. They all said that we swear that every time the waves become terrifying and we thought we were going to be overthrown and drown, we would put turba into the water and the water would become calm and subside again for a period of time. These are our brothers and sisters. These are our Shia that are in such desperate plights. What about those who arrive in the island of Lesbos? When they arrive on the island of Lesbos, they have had to battle the seas, and we have heard many stories about how thousands of people have drowned across the seas in order to try to get to these various islands. They must pay for smugglers, and they are normally put into dinghies which are not seaworthy, overcramped, and many times we hear stories of how the motors are broken and they do not run properly, And eventually they just have to wait for the tide to bring them in. Eventually, as people arrive at the island of Lesbos, there is a lack of assistance to greet them with. There aren't people who speak their language. There aren't people there who have been ready to be able to give them support and give them aid. The location for them to be able to register themselves as refugees is 70 miles inland. And so when these elderly folk or pregnant mothers or children who are carrying nothing more than the bags that they have fled the bombs of the governments or the bombs of ISIS from, have managed to arrive, but now in a desperate state, they are now asked to walk 70 miles in order to register themselves as refugees. They don't have food, they don't have clothing, they don't have shelter. And so it relies upon the refugees' agencies to be able to assist them with that. And so now they are given clothes, they are given bags which are biodegradable so that they can throw things away. They're giving sleeping bags so they can walk part of the journey and rest and then walk part of the journey, and so on and so forth. It is a very sad thing to report, for example, on the island of Lesbos, that despite it being Muslims that are fleeing, despite it being Shias that are fleeing from Iraq, from Syria, from Kuwait, in order to get to some sort of safety, it is not Muslims that are meeting with these refugees to assist them. It is non-Muslims that are assisting them when they arrive. Right now, there are Israeli doctors that have taken time out of their own work schedules to be able to go and assist these refugees. Imagine, the people we think have no human rights, the Israeli occupiers of Palestinian land, they take time in order to go and assist Muslim refugees who are fleeing from ISIS. Whilst people like you and I, we do not even think about their plight, do not make ourselves aware of their plight, do not assist them in any way, shape or form. And so here we need to reanalyze what we need to do to be able to assist them. What are the governments and what are the aid agencies doing to assist? What is the state, for example, that is trying to assist? There are certain countries that are doing far more for the refugees than others. As an example, the government of Germany has announced that it will take 800,000 refugees this year and 500,000 refugees for the next 5 years. Compare that, for example, to Britain, where in the last 5 years to date, they have only taken 750 asylum seekers in total in the last 5 years. They have only now announced, because of pressure from the people marching and demonstrating against the government, people writing and retweeting and reposting on social media against the government, they have now said that they will take 20,000 refugees over the next 5 years, and when they become 18 years old, they will deport them back to Syria. This is what Britain is doing, for example. And so there is a very poor response when you consider millions of people have been fleeing and only tens of thousands have been helped up until to date. The outcome of which is many have been in the tents and the refugee camps in Lebanon, many have been in Jordan, many are in Turkey, and now they are fleeing into Western Europe, or into Eastern Europe, and eventually into Western Europe. The governments have all had various responses. The response from the right-wing British government has been to criminalize the asylum seekers and to stop them from coming into the country. What, for example, was announced 2 weeks ago by the Home Secretary, Theresa May, she announced her new plans as to how to respond to refugees. The law at the moment is not assisting refugees and asylum seekers. The law says that you must seek asylum when you are in that particular country that you are seeking asylum to. So for example, if an Iraqi wishes to seek asylum in Britain, it first has to get to Britain. But in order to get to Britain, it has to break the law to be able to enter into Britain. And so they're criminalized for being able to try to do so. When they arrive in France, what do they see? They see police, they see fencing, they see electric fencing and barbed wire. And as a result, when these refugees try to cross over from France into Britain, they end up dying trying to do so. You will see 1 a week dies trying to get into Britain. And you'll see, unfortunately, that people get run over, people suffocate in the back of lorries, people will become electrocuted on the railway lines, and so on and so forth. And so the governmental response has not been adequate for the type of need. We often hear an argument that comes from politicians, and it is a very weak argument. They will say, we could not expect, or we could not begin to fathom the scope of the refugee crisis that was unearthing in front of our eyes. The reality is, this has not been something that has just started yesterday. This has been going on since March 2011, when governments started to fund ISIS, and ISIS started to invade Syria and started to invade Iraq. Since 2011, we could predict that people would be fleeing ISIS in their thousands, in their hundreds of thousands, and in their millions. And so it is not an adequate response from governments to say that we did not see this happening when the rest of the world saw this happening in front of their very eyes. Aid agencies are trying their best. However, there is a limit as to what aid agencies can do. And the prime reason for that is due to funding and shortages within funding. The UNHCR, the United Nations Refugee Council, and the group designated to look after the needs of refugees, they have requested a budget to aid this current refugee crisis of these 60 million people who have been displaced, and in particular, the several million fleeing from Syria and from Iraq. They have asked for a budget of $4.5 billion. To date, they have not even received half of that budget. The World Food Bank has had to cut its rations by half in the refugee camps because, again, they have been unable to meet with their budgetary needs. Think about this statistic. Annually, governments around the world spend 1,500 billion US dollars on just military spend. Just military spend. Having to purchase weapons, having to make submarines and warships and pay for armies and invasions. Yet, in order to house and shelter and feed refugees, the UNHCR cannot even put together $4.5 billion in a time like this. This is what is happening on the ground. And as a result, these individuals are living within a desperate plight and are unable to even have their basic amenities being looked after. This evening, inshallah, what we will need to do is to talk about what the Islamic response is to refugees and to migration and to the needs of these individuals. And then to look at the solutions for these individuals and the types of things that we can demand and seek as a response for the needs of these refugees. In regards to the way in which Islam perceives refugees and the migrants and the need of migrants, the first thing is to go back into human nature and to understand how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made human beings, and for us to be able to appreciate the nature of human movement from location to location. Human beings have been born free. As we've been stating in the previous nights, nation states that place arbitrary borders between people, that seek to separate human beings from one another, is a natural or is unnatural and is an imposition upon the natural state of the human being. The natural state of the human being is to be able to travel, to be able to explore, to not be curtailed by anything. And so the nation states is an imposition upon human nature. How do we prove it is human nature to travel and to explore in accordance with need and circumstances? When you look into anthropological study, human beings have also always been travelers by nature. For example, the way in which human beings used to live was that they did not have cities and towns and tribes that were stationed in one place. Tribes used to follow the migrationary patterns of animals and livestock. And so where oxen went, or where sheep went, or where cows went, human beings used to follow these migrationary patterns and hunt and kill these animals for the sake of food, for the sake of skin, and so on and so forth, as long as these migrationary patterns were taking place. Eventually, 70,000 years ago, when the last ice age occurred, the whole of modern-day Europe began to freeze. And so people in their hundreds and thousands moved south towards the equator, where eventually human beings began to spring up from Africa and from the Middle East. In this period of time, human beings learned, instead of following the migrationary patterns of animals, we would become stationary as people. We would learn to be able to capture animals. We would place them in one location, and we would begin to herd them, train them, domesticate them, and be able to have stationed and settled farmlands. And so now, instead of following migrationary patterns, they could take from farmland and could be able to take from the animals. This has always been the nature of humankind, to be able to move whenever they sought freely, whenever the need was to be able to move. All religions have been based upon migrationary patterns, on movement as refugees, and the need to flee and escape tyranny and oppression. If you look at, for example, the story of Banu Israel, when Musa alayhi salam frees Banu Israel from the clutches of Fir'aun, they migrate from Egypt to the Holy Lands. Why? In order to save themselves from the persecution of Fir'aun. And so whenever we speak to our Jewish counterparts, we should be able to impress upon them that the same way you, as your history, sought refuge from Fir'aun and safety in another land, it should be for all human beings to be able to seek refuge in another land without having to face the notion of, well, barriers and borders stop them from moving into a land. If you look, for example, several months ago, the Pope stated that Isa alayhi salam, Jesus Christ, is also a refugee, that he is the son of a refugee, that we hear the story of Lady Maryam salamullahi alayha. Mary had to travel across lands in order to come to a location and give birth to Jesus Christ salamullahi alayhim ajma'een. And so even within the history of Christianity, it has been based upon migration. In Islam too, the history of Islam is also based upon migration. We have, for example, the first migration where the Muslims fled in Mecca to get towards Ethiopia, where they were granted safety by the king Negus. Afterwards, the Muslims also migrated from Mecca to Medina, and they managed to live in peace in the city of Medina. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about this and mentions in the Holy Quran the values of those who began to flee and became migrants from Mecca, and those who assisted in Medina, known as the Ansar. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, for example, in chapter number 8 of the Holy Quran, Surah Anfal, verse number 84, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَهَاجَرُوا وَجَاهَدُوا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ وَالَّذِينَ آوَوا وَالنَّصَرُوا أُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ حَقًّا. Those who believe and migrate and struggle hard in the way of Allah, and those who help the migrants, they are truly the mu'mineen. أُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ حَقًّا. Those are surely the truest of the mu'mineen. Not only are they mu'mineen, they are mu'minuna haqqa, which is a higher daraja. Why? Because they chose the option to flee from persecution and place their faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the Ansar, they were welcoming to the Muhajirun and assisted those people when they came into their lands. How did the Ansar help? The Ansar gave away their wealth and even their homes. They opened up their homes to the Muhajirun and became brothers in faith and brothers in humanity to those people who moved from Mecca to Medina. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Al-mu'minuna ikhwa. Surely the believers are brothers of each other. And when the Muhajirun and the Ansar came into the houses of each other, they didn't just share faith, they didn't just share land and housing and location and business wealth. They became brothers of each other by virtue of them learning to look after each other at such a level, moving from desperation to helping the needs of each other. Here, Islam has its own concept of how to perceive migration. And there are many narrations that we can mention, but there are two in particular which are profound, that speak about the concept and the legality of freedom of movement in the eyes of Islam. The first is a hadith from Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayh, where he states that one who migrates will receive several benefits. The first is they will flee anxiety. So imagine those people who are fleeing the captivity of ISIS, the bombs of ISIS, and so on and so forth. They receive freedom from their anxiety, number one. They will also receive the opportunity for new work. They will receive the opportunity to receive new education. They will get the opportunity to gain new mannerisms and get the peak of their akhlaq. Why? Because they will move into foreign lands, foreign people. They will now see how other people live, and they will want to be able to live in the very best form, either of their own mannerisms or learning to migrate to a practice of others if they see that there are better standards of living. And they will also make new friends, because when you leave and you learn to meet new people, you will make new friends, people that you did not know previously. There are certain jurisprudential rulings around migration that Islam seeks to offer the individual who wants to migrate. The first is that if there is oppression and you did not flee and your religion is at stake, it is required for you to be able to leave and migrate from that land where your religion is going to be taken away from you. The Quran has a verse in Surah An-Nisa, chapter number 4, verses 97 to 100. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, the malaika, when they take the lives of those people who were deemed weak within the lands, they will ask, what state did you find yourselves in? Why was it that you had lost your religion? Why is it that you became irreligious within your own lands? The weak will say, but we were weak within the lands. We did not have any strength to practice our religion. We were downtrodden and so couldn't practice our religion. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states that the angels will respond and say, isn't the earth of Allah wide enough for you to be able to travel within? Excuse me. Isn't the earth wide enough for you to be able to travel within? Could you not flee into different parts of the world? And so Islam seeks to be able to provide the migrant with the responsibility and the opportunity to flee whenever their life, whenever their religion is at stake. And so it is upon an individual to be able to travel. The problem here is when these Muslims and any religion seeks to be able to fulfill this natural state of saving their life, saving their property, saving their religion, again they are faced with borders and walls to be able to try and stop them. There is another hadith which comes to us from our sixth Imam, Jaffer as-Sadiq, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayhi, where he says, لا تعرب بعد الهجرة ولا هجرة بعد الفتح. There is no movement after migration, and there is no migration after victory. What does this hadith mean? This hadith is explained by His Eminence, Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Hussein al-Sistani. May Allah grant him the longest of life. Sayyid Sistani in his website says, Ta'arrub here means the migration from a place where there is religious security to a place where there is less religious security. From a place where you will be able to practice your religion freely to a place where you will not be able to practice your religion freely. This is ta'arrub. La ta'arrub ba'dal hijrah. There is no movement after hijrah. Meaning, once you have found a location, once you have migrated, your people, your family, you have migrated to a place where there is safety for you to be able to practice your religion, la ta'arrub ba'dal hijrah. There is no movement to another place after a place of safety. The next part of the hadith says, وَلَا حِجْرَةُ بَعْدَ الْفَتْحِ. And there is no migration after the victory of Islam. If you are living in a place where Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam is present, when you live in a place where the A'imma alayhimus salam are present, there is no migration for you from there. It is not permissible for you to leave the side of the Prophet and go in an arbitrary way. Of course, if he allows you to move or you wish to spread Islam, but you cannot move from the Prophet to another land. And so it shows you that religion is sanctified. Life and property is sanctified. When things like this are threatened, it is upon you to be able to move. When you have opportunity to practice your religion freely, then it is not for you to move. And these are the principles that Islam puts towards migration. Unfortunately, because we live in a world of nation states, people now divide each other and want to reject others. Famously, the Republican presidential candidate, Donald Trump, has his own solutions to the migration crisis. When people are fleeing Mexico and there are drug cartels, when there is a broken economy, when people cannot live properly, they seek to migrate naturally to a world where there is more for them. To the extent that they will try to migrate into the United States of America and find the most basic, mundane, most difficult of jobs that you and I would never seek to take in our lives. What do? They will clean toilets. They will become janitors. They will become people who serve in restaurants. They will take jobs which maybe you and I might look down upon, but we seek for them to be done by other people. In order to have some shot at safety in their lives, we now look down upon these people who are fleeing from the worst kind of life. What is the solution from Donald Trump? I'll build a wall, and that will keep people out. The reality is, this is not a solution. Why is this not a solution? This isn't a solution because, as we mentioned on the first night of our majlis, that the migration crisis will only get worse over the next 30 years. Why? Currently, our global population is 7.2 billion people. According to studies, we will increase our global population by 800 million people over the next 15 years. By 2030, we will arrive at 8 billion people on this planet. If now the world cannot even adequately respond to several 100,000 people migrating because of a war and an occupation in Syria and in Iraq, war in Sudan, poverty in Eritrea and Somalia, war in Libya. If the world cannot even handle this type of migration, what will happen in 15 years' time when the world's population will increase by the equivalent of India? And so we desperately need better solutions to the migration crisis that is presented to the world today. This evening, inshallah, we want to talk about various solutions that you and I can provide, or that the world can provide, and that you and I can engage in our discussions. We can promote to our governments, we can partake in online, we can partake in the movements. The first solution is, of course, to change our attitude towards the refugees, the asylum seekers, and the migrants. The problem we have at the moment is, by and large, the world is very apathetic towards the plight of the migrants around the world. What do we mean? It's not that we don't empathize. We do empathize. Many people will seek, dua. Many people will seek to help by watching the news, by becoming acquainted with the plight of the migrant crisis. However, apathy is because we do not go out of our way to make a difference tangibly to the plights of these particular individuals. Apathy means that we sit at home and we do not partake in their struggle to practically assist them. What did we mention earlier? On the island of Lesbos, it is not Muslims that are helping. The doctors, the lawyers are coming from the illegal and illegitimate state of Israel. Imagine how much of a shame this must be upon the Muslim when Israeli doctors are doing more for Muslims than Muslims are doing for Muslims. This means that we haven't understood the whole story of Islam. If you and I were born 1400 years ago, we would not be amongst the Ansar. Truly, we would not be أُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ حَقًّا. We would not truly be the mu'mineen because we were not assisting the migrants in their desperate plight. And so the first thing is for us to remove our apathy and the mentality, the attitude we have towards refugees and migrants. It's shocking to say that when you speak to Muslims, many of them here, and especially here, for example, now in this hall, many of us listening to this speech around the world, we are either migrants or children of migrants. Meaning that we also sought a better life from our lands in which we were born in, or our ancestral homelands. And if we weren't given assistance in the first place, we would not be here being able to live a life of comfort the way you and I live. And so the same way we expected assistance to come to us, it should be that we aim to give assistance to those people who are in such a desperate plight at the moment in the refugee and migrant crisis. What can we do to assist? How can we assist those people around the world who are undergoing this refugee and migrant crisis? The best things that we can do is to help with the charitable organizations and the aid agencies that seek to assist. As we mentioned earlier, the World Food Bank and the UNHCR is underfunded by more than 50%. And so what we can do is begin to collect and pass on to the aid agencies. We can fund the aid agencies. We can champion for our governments to fully fund the aid agencies around the world. We also need to go and assist directly those people who are arriving at the places where refugees arrive at. So for example, in Calais, in Greece, we can take a week, 2 weeks off from our work. We can fly there and we can assist those people. How? They do not understand Greek. They only speak Arabic. The United Nations Refugee Council, the workers, the aid agencies are Europeans. They don't speak Arabic, they don't speak Farsi, they don't speak Urdu, they don't speak dialects of Arabic. And so they need people on the ground to be able to explain and assist to them what is going to take place, where they can be able to find things from, what the solutions are, what their legal rights are, because they don't even understand these things when they arrive in these particular places. It needs a response from you and I to be able to assist them. The next thing we can do is to be able to lobby our governments. It is completely unbefitting of certain governments to be taking such a low number of refugees. To take 20,000 is insufficient when there are 4 and 5 million people who are fleeing from ISIS bombs. In the Middle East, some of the Middle Eastern countries have not pledged to take a single refugee. In the United Arab Emirates, in Qatar, in Saudi Arabia, they take a grand total of 0 refugees. And the question should be answered. Why would Saudi Arabia want to take these refugees? Why would Qatar want to take these refugees? The answer is very simple. Why would they take the very same people they seek to be driving out of Syria and in Iraq into their own lands? Because this leads to the next point. In order for us to be able to stop the refugee crisis, we need to be able to stop the funding of ISIS. And so we need to go and trace back where the funding is taking place. We know that ISIS are getting their funding, getting their freedom of movement from certain countries. They're getting their freedom of movement from Turkey. They are getting funding from Qatar and from Saudi Arabia. They are being given tanks and weaponry by the United States of America. They are being given their tanks and weaponry by the United Kingdom and the British government. And so it should be, firstly, for the world to be able to stand up and say, stop funding these rebel groups that are killing and butchering Syrians and Iraqis. Stop funding ISIS so that they kill and butcher Syrians and Iraqis. And through this, people would not be able to flee in the first place. We need to be able to promote a political solution. And only through a political solution and the criminalization of those people who seek to fund these terrorist groups in the first place, then we will be able to stop the war and stop the migration and refugee crisis. Saudi Arabia and Qatar, if they seek to impose their own proxy governments, ISIS governments, in Syria and in Iraq, why would they want the people fleeing from ISIS to come into their country in the first place? We also need to be able to forgive the debts of these particular countries. Interestingly, Turkey, right now, are taking on 1 million refugees. The European Union and World Bank have done a deal with Turkey, and that is that they will help fund the refugees that live within Turkey in order to stop them coming over to Central Europe, because that means they're no longer the problem of Europe, they remain the problem of Turkey. The World Bank is seeking to do a deal. This deal, think about the problem of this deal. The deal is that they will ask the countries that are asking Turkey to hold and house the refugees so that they don't go into these other countries, they will ask these countries to pay the interest on the loan from the World Bank to Turkey, so that Turkey doesn't have to bear the burden of the interest to be able to pay to house the refugees. But what does that mean? It still requires Turkey to take the loan from the World Bank in the first place in order to pay for the housing of the refugees. And so it must fall upon those countries that started this war, that caused this war in the first place, to pay for these particular refugees, as opposed to asking the World Bank to pay for these refugees. It should fall upon Turkey. They should not be taking a loan. They should be paying for it themselves. The fact that they allowed people to enter across the border of Turkey and enter into ISIS camps in the first place. It should be for America and Britain. It should be for Qatar and Saudi Arabia to pay for the entire relocation as reparations for this particular refugee crisis. And we should be seeking for that to take place. These are the solutions that we can promote right now. There also must be solutions for the future. What are the solutions for the future? The first thing that we must do is that we must re-understand the world and how the world must seek a common solution for the global refugee crisis. It cannot be on Germany to take 800,000 one year, 500,000 another year, whilst Britain only takes 20,000 over the space of 5 years. It cannot be that certain countries will say that we will only take Christian refugees and not take Muslim refugees, like certain European countries said. This is not a globalized response. The world is made up of 207 sovereign states. 193 of them are registered to the United Nations. And so there should be a global common response to the refugee crisis, and not just certain countries being made to take the burden of all of these particular refugees. Right now, Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey are taking the majority of the refugees. It must be that the world responds as opposed to just certain countries responding. Number one. Number two, we must be able to think about our global future response to the refugee crisis. As we've been saying, the world will increase by almost 1 billion people in 15 years. The solutions that we have at the moment are not sustainable, not suitable to this particular circumstance. In every other matter, we seek to prepare in advance for our world. We do it at our own individual levels, and we do it at a global level. Let me explain. For example, at a global level, we prepare for any worst case scenario. If, God forbid, there is a fire that occurs, we know that we have a drill, a response as to how we're going to plan for a fire. We have a fire drill. We know where our exits are. We know where we're going to stand outside, because this gives us safety and protection from a fire. In the same way, right now, there is something called the Doomsday Seed Vault. Have a look on this when you go home and look on Google, inshallah, this evening. There is an island which is 800 miles off the North Pole in one of the Norwegian islands. And dug deep into this island, in the snow, there is a vault which houses 850,000 seeds. All different types of food, rice and different seeds and different flowers. Why? In order to prepare for a doomsday-like event. God forbid, if there is a nuclear holocaust or something of that event, then we have seeds and we have food that we can redistribute around the world. Why is it that humankind has prepared for such an event when it comes to starvation, but we are not prepared in advance for a global refugee crisis? It is unthinkable. And so again, we require our politicians to come out, our academics, our leaders, to plan for such a global crisis, such as global warming, or another war that, God forbid, may take place. And so we need to prepare in advance for these particular matters. Lastly, we must uplift certain economies. The reason as to why people flee from one location to another, yes, is to flee war, yes, is to flee disease. but many are economic migrants. Why? Because their economy has been destroyed. Their economy is falling flat. And so it requires for us to be able to uplift countries, to help with trade, to help with moving certain companies abroad, to be able to help with trade and to lift countries that are so broken and impoverished around the world. Instead of, for example, Mexicans thinking they have to flee across the border to live and find a job in the United States of America, it would be better for us to help uplift and break and make an economy within Mexico and to help this country be able to revitalize itself. Here this evening, we have spoken about the refugee crisis, the migrant crisis around the world, and explained why this is happening and some of the solutions that we can partake in order to assist these people around the world. We ask, inshallah, that we take as much as we can away from this discussion and for you and I to think about our role as individuals and as institutions as how we can react best to the needs of the refugees around the world. Tonight, we remember Awn and Muhammad, the two children of Abdullah and Sayyidah Zainab. These two children are 10 and 12 years old. And the same plights that you can see today of hunger and thirst and fleeing of oppression, you can imagine the children of Fatima having to undergo 1400 years ago. This was the sacrifice of Abdullah, who could not be there on the plains of Karbala to assist Hussein ibn Ali. On the afternoon of the 10th of Muharram, body after body after body was being brought back by Hussein ibn Ali, by Abbas, by Akbar, back towards the camps. Every time the bodies would have been retrieved, having been torn into pieces, having been cut by the swords from the enemies, having had the spears embedded into them, having had their bodies riddled with the arrows, the women and children would come out and lament the killings of their fathers, of their brothers, of their protectors, of their sons. But every one of these family members and companions would consistently go towards Hussein and say, "Oh Hussein, allow us to be next." And each time Hussein would make an excuse. But each and every mother and each and every wife was saying to their menfolk, "Go, do not come back unless I have seen that your body has been given in the way of Hussein." Sayyidah Zainab with her own two children was no different. The narrations tell us that when Awn and Muhammad went towards Sayyidah Zainab would turn away from them as if to say, "Oh my sons, what are you still doing here? I have seen the companions of Hussein going and I have seen their bodies being taken back from the battlefield. I have already seen some of your family members going. Your cousins have been given in the way of Hussein, but you are still here. Why do you come and approach me? We have seen Ali Akbar go in the way, but I have my son still here whilst Hussein has lost one of his own sons. Why do you come to me, Awn and Muhammad?" Awn and Muhammad would respond to their mother and say, "Oh, our mother, we have begged Hussein to allow us to go. But each time he just places his arms around us, embraces us and says, 'But you are a delight for your mother. You are a delight and a comfort for your mother. I cannot let you go into the battlefield.'" Hearing that Sayyidah Zainab was the excuse to stop her sons going into the battlefield, she immediately approaches her brother and says, "Oh brother, would you allow me to be embarrassed in front of our mother Fatima on the Day of Judgment? Will you allow me to face my mother like this? Hussein says, "Oh my sister, why do you say such words? This tears my heart. Why do you ask this question?" She says, "Every time my sons wish to go, you forbid them from entering in the battlefield." Hussein realizes this is the moment when he must give his nephews, when he must send his own nephews into the battlefield. He looks at them and says, "Oh my dear sons, oh sons of Zainab, I give you permission to enter into the battlefield." You would think that children would be afraid. You would think that children would now look at their mother and hope for some way out. Rather, they immediately pick up the swords. Anyone who knows the boy who was 10 or 12 years old, can you imagine how weighty that sword must be? Can you imagine how weighty a shield must be? Yet it must be these 10 and 12-year-old boys, but 10 and 12-year-old boys that would wage war against men. But have no fear. These are the sons of Banu Hashim. They have the blood of Jaffer in them. They have the blood of Hamza in them. They have the blood of Ali ibn Abi Talib in them. They have the blood of Rasulullah in them. They have the tongue of Fatima in them. They have the glory of Khadija in them. And so they pick up their weapons. They bid farewell to their family members. They bid farewell to their mother, and they enter into the battlefield. The narrations state that they dispatch dozens of the enemies into the pitfalls of hell. It is said that the way in which these two brothers fight is the way in which they kept away the enemies. They would stand back to back in order to face all the enemies coming towards them. The enemies could not come one-on-one, because even when they came one-on-one, Awn and Muhammad would dispatch them. In order to stop them, now Umar ibn Sa'ad shouts out to his army, "Do not approach these two children face to face. They are killing you all. Surround them and you will be able to defeat them." The Maqtal says that when they surrounded Awn and Muhammad, they attacked them from each and every side. They began to throw spears into that circle. And so as they were defending the showering spears and the showering arrows, that is when the enemies would come with their swords and begin to strike them. Even so, the sons of Zainab knew how to defend against this. Umar ibn Sa'ad shouts, "The only way you will defeat these two sons of Zainab is to separate the sons. Separate Awn and Muhammad." Oh brothers, you know how much your brother means to you. How would it be that if you are back to back with your brother, but in a minute the enemies try to separate you from your brother, how much your heart would hurt. Abbas and Hussein being brothers, how they must have looked at these two brothers, the example of these two brothers. They continue to surround Awn and Muhammad. They separate the two brothers. I imagine that Awn, the elder brother, would have looked towards Muhammad in order to say, "Oh Muhammad, are you okay whilst you are fighting? It is my responsibility as the elder brother to look after you. I am being separated from you. Please forgive me." I imagine that even though he was fighting, he must be looking after his younger brother as best as he can. The enemies now have separated Awn and Muhammad. They begin to surround each and every one of them. If as a two of them they had to fight off the spears and the arrows being showered upon them as two, imagine how they had to fight off being surrounded as separated and as one. The enemies begin to strike at each and every one of them, begin to strike down the sons of Zainab. Both of them fall towards the floor and call out towards their uncle, "Assalamu alayka ya Aba Abdillah." It is said that he rushes in towards the battlefield. He goes and sits down beside Awn. One Khatib says that he imagines that Awn would have sent Hussein towards his brother Muhammad. "Oh my uncle, please do not sit with me whilst my younger brother has his final breaths." And when Hussein goes towards Muhammad, Muhammad would look at Hussein and say, "Oh Hussein, go back to my brother Awn, for I do not want him to die unless he is in your arms." Hussein would go back and see that Awn has passed from this world. The narration says that when he brings the bodies back, that one of the brothers is still alive, that still he is alive, and in his last moments his body is about to escape from this world. It is said that he comes towards Sayyida Zainab and he finds Sayyida Zainab in the tents. All the ladies have come out to welcome the bodies of Own and Muhammad. Zainab is in the tents. Hussein enters into the tents to call Zainab out to see the body of her sons. She comes and she finds that Zainab is in sajda, saying thank you to Allah for granting her children martyrdom in the way of Hussein ibn Ali. She comes towards Zainab. Oh, my sister Zainab, one of your sons is still alive. He still has breath in him. Please come towards him and wish him farewell. The Maqtal says that Zainab comes out of that tent and sits beside her son. Her son's lips are beginning to move, whispering something in the final amount of breath that he has. Zainab puts her ears towards her son's lips. Oh, my son, what do you wish to tell me? What are your last words that you want me to hear from you? The Maqtal says that the young son whispers into the ears of Zainab, oh mother, know that we reached the river Euphrates, but we never drank any water knowing that Hussein was still thirsty. Be proud of us, mother. Be proud that we never drank any water, that we continue to fight. With these words, his soul departed from him. Zainab begins to look at Hussein. Her tears are not for her sons. Her tears are for Hussein, knowing that Hussein remains thirsty. The narrations tell us that when she comes back, she meets Abdullah, her husband. But it is said that as she comes towards the house, she is in such a way that Abdullah meets her and says, oh lady, I have come out to meet the children. I have come out to meet the ladies of Banu Hashim. There is a lady who I am looking for. Her name is Zainab bint Ali. You have come with the caravan. I have not seen my wife. I cannot find her. Tell me, do you know of my wife Zainab bint Ali? Zainab, with her back bent, with her hair grey, she lifts her veil and says, oh Abdullah, oh my husband, I am Zainab. I am Zainab. Do you not recognize your own wife? I have been through so much. I have lost everyone. I have had everyone taken from me. I have been captive and paraded from city to city. Oh Abdullah, let me tell you of my plight. Let me tell you that they whipped Sakina. Let me tell you that they threw boiling water upon us. Oh Abdullah, let me tell you that they set fire to my chador. Oh Abdullah, let me tell you that they tried to sell us off as slaves in front of Yazid. Oh Abdullah, let me tell you how I had to leave Sakina in the prisons of Sham. Oh Abdullah, let me tell you that when I came back to Karbala, how I had to bury the heads and how I had to bury the bodies. Oh Abdullah, let me tell you of my plight. Throughout all of this, Zainab never mentions Awn and Muhammad. She never once mentions the children. Eventually Zainab goes into the house. We hear by the khutbah that as she enters into the room of her two children, she sees standing on the walls are two small sajjada, are two small musalla and prayer mats. She looks at these two prayer mats and for the first time she begins to cry over Awn and Muhammad. Wa Muhammada, wa Awna. Oh Awn, oh Muhammad, oh the apples of my eye. I have not cried for you until today, but now I see the prayer mats, I cry for you. مات من حسين يا حسين